Good morning. Welcome to Policy Exchange. I'm Max Chambers. I'm the Head of Crime and Justice here at Policy Exchange. It's great to see such a packed house. We wanted to do an event like this, first of all, because it's the first anniversary, the one-year anniversary of the first set of PCC elections next week. But for Policy Exchange, it's actually something different. We've been talking about the idea of police commissioners since 2003. So for us, it's a 10-year anniversary rather than a 1 year. So it's great to be hosting this event and great to share a stage with some of the, the pioneers of this reform. But as well as being celebratory, it's also exploratory. So we want to know, how's this reform actually going? How's it working? There have been good and bad press, but the truth's probably somewhere in the middle. And the truth, is probably far more interesting and far more meaningful in terms of what's going on in that middle part. So we'll hear more about the PCC perspective in a moment. But first, I want to introduce the Home Secretary, who's been leading this police reform agenda. It's been a big agenda. It's not just been about PCCs. It's also been about the National Crime Agency and lots of other structural reforms to policing as well. And those changes have all been made while delivering substantial cuts in crime. So it's a big achievement. Home Secretary, thank you very much for coming. We're all really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much indeed, Max, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here today at Policy Exchange, which, as you have reminded everybody, was actually the think tank that originally proposed elections to improve the accountability of the police. And it's very good to be here to mark the first anniversary of the Police and Crime Commissioners and your 10th anniversary in terms of talking about this subject. It's also very good to be here with Police and Crime Commissioners from across the political spectrum, Vera Baird, Adam Simmonds and Salmon, and to look at, as Max has said, to look at Police and Crime Commissioners 1 year on, but also to look ahead in relation to the PCCs. Now, 3.5 years ago, the government embarked on the most comprehensive programme of police reform in memory. And when we did so, the response from many people in policing, from the Police Federation to the Association of Chief Police Officers, was that there was no need at all for police reform. And I remember my opposite number in Parliament bemoaning the perfect storm that a combination of spending cuts and our police reforms would deliver. But 3.5 years on, who now doubts the need for police reform? There are now even independent reviews into the roles of the Police Federation and the Association of Chief Police Officers, and I read recently that even Yvette Cooper now thinks police reform is badly needed, which I suppose is a case of better late than never. In the time it's taken Labour to realise the need for police reform, we've given Chief Constables genuine operational independence by scrapping all national targets. We've increased police productivity by getting rid of reams of paperwork imposed by the Home Office. We've rewarded skills and not just time served by delivering radical police pay reforms that previous governments could not deliver. We've empowered local communities by publishing detailed street-level crime maps and mandating beat meetings. We want to shine a light on police performance, so we've made the Inspectorate of Constabulary more independent. We want the highest standards of police integrity, so we're beefing up the IPCC and taking a range of other measures. We want to improve policing skills and the evidence base for what works, so we've set up a college of policing. We've taken a new approach to serious and organised crime, so we've created the National Crime Agency. And we've done all of these things at the same time as reducing national police budgets by 20% over 4 years. Far from creating the perfect storm, our police reforms are working, and recorded crime has fallen by more than 10% under this government. The police are proving, more than any other public service, that through reform you can deliver more with less. Now, the observant among you may have noticed that in my list of reforms, I didn't mention police and crime commissioners. And that's because I want to focus today, I want to talk today about the first generation of commissioners in some detail, warts and all. But before I do so, let's just cast our minds back. Let's think back to how the police were held to account before the 15th of November 2012. Invisible, ineffective committees of unknown appointed councillors were supposed to hold each police force in England and Wales to account on behalf of local people. But only 7% of people knew that police authorities even existed. How are they supposed to convey the concerns of the local public? How are they supposed to provide a link between police leaders and the people? How were they supposed to have legitimacy in making important decisions and holding their forces to account when they had no contact with the public, when they did their business effectively in secret, and when they were installed rather than elected? It's beyond me how they were expected to have that legitimacy in that context. Whatever anybody thinks about the turnout in the elections last year, or the performance of individual police and crime commissioners, and I'll come on to those shortly, surely nobody could propose a return to the dark days of those invisible police authorities. So the purpose of directly elected police and crime commissioners was clear. They'd be elected, visible, well-known in their communities, and accountable to the electorate. They'd provide an impetus to reform, innovate, and deliver policing more efficiently. They'd be powerful figures with responsibility for writing the police plan, setting the police budget and precept, and hiring and firing chief constables. In short, they would bring, probably for the first time ever, real local scrutiny of how chief constables and their forces perform. Now, I want to assess the performance of police and crime commissioners against those three tests. How visible and accountable are they? What reforms and innovations are they driving? And to what extent are they making full use of their powers to hold their forces to account? Now, the first test of the Commissioner's visibility and accountability was, of course, the elections last November. Now, let's be honest, at 15%, the turnout was disappointing. It still meant that more than 5 million people voted for police and crime commissioners, more than 5 million votes more than any police authority ever received, but we should clearly want turnout to be higher than that in future. And I think we've every reason to believe that turnout will be higher. First of all, the elections will be held in May, not November. They'll be held at the same time as local elections across the country. The debate won't be an abstract conversation about what police and crime commissioners are, but a robust exchange between an incumbent defending their record and other candidates challenging it. And next time round, the role of police and crime commissioners will be better understood by the public. Now, I've already mentioned that only 7% of people knew that police authorities existed. But today, around 70% of people know about their police and crime commissioner. And even though police and crime commissioners have been in place for just 1 year, they're already receiving 10, 20, sometimes even 50 times the volume of correspondence received by police authorities. Not sure whether they'll thank me for that. But I believe there is more that can be done to improve the public's awareness and understanding of the performance of their local police force and their police and crime commissioner. I'll come on to that later. But I believe that those signs do suggest that we will see better turnout next time round. Now, many individual police and crime commissioners have played a visible role in incidents relevant to the communities they represent, like Matthew Ellis, who responded to the revelations about Stafford Hospital, and Mark Burns-Williamson, who responded to allegations about the conduct of his Chief Constable, Norman Bettison, earlier in his career. The second test I set for police and crime commissioners is to what extent are they driving reform, innovation, and the delivery of more efficient policing. And here I think we are seeing some very encouraging signs. Although Bob Jones, the Police and Crime Commissioner in the West Midlands, took the early decision not to proceed with the Business for Partnering for Police scheme, which would have used the private sector to deliver more efficient policing support services, he has since revealed plans to design and implement a business and ICT improvement plan, working with the private sector. In West Mercia and Warwickshire, Bill Longmore and Ron Ball oversee a strategic alliance. The alliance means that all posts below Deputy Chief Constable are shared between the forces, but both forces retain their own Chief Constables, who remain accountable to the two commissioners for the delivery of policing. As a result, the two forces are making significant savings, while retaining their distinct identities, and local policing priorities continue to be set according to local needs. According to the Inspectorate of Constabulary, the alliance will allow West Mercia and Warwickshire to achieve 75% and 94% of their respective spending review savings by 2014-15. That's surely a better model than the traditional ACPO solution of continually merging forces and taking accountability further and further away from local communities. Now, many police and crime commissioners are looking not just to reform and make savings by collaborating with other forces, but with other emergency services. In Northamptonshire, Adam Simmonds has been bold enough to question why we have 3 separate emergency services. He's considering ways of integrating the police and fire service, and I know with the support of his local county council, he's looking at setting up a combined headquarters, possibly inside a new county council centre. This is exactly the sort of innovation I want the government not just to applaud, but take firm action across the whole country to help deliver. In Merseyside, Jane Kennedy has signed a contract giving the go-ahead for a new joint police and fire command and control centre, and building work is already underway. In Surrey, Kevin Hurley is driving collaboration between the 3 emergency services as part of the Public Services Transformation Network. This will see Surrey Police, Surrey Fire and Rescue, and the South East Coast Ambulance Service come together to deliver streamlined operations, share more premises, and deliver joint safety campaigns. In Thames Valley, Hampshire and Surrey, Anthony Stansfield, Simon Hayes and Kevin Hurley have signed a landmark contract with BT. The South East Police Shared Network Services Agreement is valued at £37.4 million and is designed to transform the telecoms technology used by the 3 forces, enabling them to save money, share information better across the 3 forces, and deliver a better service for the public. The third test I set for police and crime commissioners is to what extent they're making full use of their powers to hold their forces to account. And here I think the picture is a little mixed. I know that many police and crime commissioners were horrified when they saw their counterparts rush to the defence of their local forces after the Independent Police Complaints Commission cast doubt on the internal disciplinary investigations into the treatment of Andrew Mitchell in Sutton Coldfield last year. I've made my views clear on what the IPCC said about that case, and while I'm not going to stand here and condemn those commissioners, it will be down to them to explain to their local communities whether in rushing to defend their local forces and condemn the IPCC, they showed good judgment. Because the role of a police and crime commissioner is not just to parrot lines to take, but to use the powers we gave them to hold their forces to account. They set the police budget and precept, they write the local policing plan, and ultimately they can hire and fire chief constables. On police budgets and precepts, I've already talked about the many innovations being driven by police and crime commissioners to make their forces more efficient. That commissioners like Sir Clive Loader in Leicestershire and Katie Bourne in Sussex, along with many others, have frozen the precept, shows their thinking of hard-working people in their local communities and challenging the police to do more with less, rather than going for the easy option and demanding more money from local taxpayers. And I think that is a very good sign. Police and crime commissioners are also using their power to write their policing plans to make sure their forces are prioritising the issues of most importance to their communities. Unlike the days when the Home Office decided the priorities of local police forces, those local plans reflect local need. And that's a very good thing indeed. In some forces, though, I know the Police and Crime Commissioner has imposed performance targets. I'm not overjoyed with that. There's a very good reason I've abolished all national police targets, but it is the prerogative of police and crime commissioners to introduce local targets if they want to do so. Some police and crime commissioners are using other powers available to them to hold their force to account. Anne Barnes, the Police and Crime Commissioner in Kent, called in the Inspectorate of Constabulary to look at the force's recording of crime and, as a result, uncovered practices that were frankly inappropriate. Action was taken to put things right, and as a result, the residents of Kent can have confidence in how the police record crime. The ability of police and crime commissioners to hire and fire chief constables was perhaps the most controversial power we granted, especially to chief constables. And while I'm not going to go into the rights and wrongs of every decision by a commissioner to hire or fire a chief constable, the truth is that this power is fundamental to the reform. Chief constables have to know where accountability lies. It stops with the democratically elected representative, the Police and Crime Commissioner. And again, I emphasise, without approving or criticising any individual decisions that have been made, it's a positive sign that the commissioners have been prepared to use this power. So there's a fair amount of good news in terms of the performance of police and crime commissioners up and down the country. I've mentioned one or two examples of how things could and perhaps should have gone better. And of course, there are some examples of behaviour where things ought to have been better. The IPCC has investigated 4 police and crime commissioners. For 2 of those investigations, relating to Winston Roddick in North Wales and Simon Hayes in Hampshire, no further action was taken. Another, Ron Hogg in Durham, is still under investigation by the IPCC for actions when he was Deputy Chief Constable of Cleveland. And the remaining case in Lancashire is with the Crown Prosecution Service. Obviously, there is little I can say about these live cases, but any case of wrongdoing, particularly in anything related to policing, is deplorable and should be investigated and punished accordingly. So the truth is, both in terms of the performance of individual police and crime commissioners and the system as a whole, there has been good and bad. And this was always likely to be the case. Localism is always messy and uneven, and reform is always difficult and uncertain. But I think that 1 year on, there is enough that is positive for us to be pleased with the introduction of police and crime commissioners. So I want to turn now to the measures I want to introduce to help our changes to bed down and for police and crime commissioners to perform better. I said earlier that we can do more to improve the public's awareness and understanding of the performance of their local police force. If we succeed, this will improve their understanding of police and crime commissioners, increase popular participation in policing, and drive up turnout in future police and crime commissioner elections. And I think there are 3 main ways we can improve things. First, through building on the success of crime maps. Second, by making police forces much more transparent. And third, through the Inspectorate of Constabulary, making clear to the people in simpler terms how forces are performing. Detailed street-level crime maps are one of the IT successes of this government. Police.uk crashed on the day it went live. I know you'll say it was a government website, but it actually didn't crash because of the usual glitches. It crashed because of the enormous demand. Since its launch nearly 3 years ago, it's attracted 634 million hits from 58 million visits, and that demand has continued. The latest figures show an average of more than 8.8 million hits from 471,000 visits per month. Crime maps let people see what crime takes place where they live, how much of it is detected, what happens when the perpetrator is identified, and they let people compare how crime is dealt with locally compared to nearby communities. But we want to keep on making them even better and making policing even more transparent. So I'm pleased to say we are today relaunching police.uk with a new look and new functions that will give the public even more access to information about crime and how it is dealt with in their community. I also want police forces to become more transparent about what they spend and what they do. I'm realistic that not everybody in this country is going to want to pore over spreadsheets of police data, but the experience of publishing this data in other parts of the public sector is that it is used by the media and others to improve accountability, and it encourages prudence, efficiency, and better decision-making. So the Home Office will soon come forward with proposals to require police forces to publish not just spending data in raw form, but more performance data too. But it's not just raw data that is going to help the public to understand the performance of their local police forces. And this is where the Inspectorate of Constabulary comes in. The government's reforms have already made HMIC more independent of the police and of government. And in Tom Windsor, it is led by the first ever Chief Inspector who has not served as a police officer. And I know he shares my determination to make HMIC's work more relevant and more understandable to members of the public. HMIC's thematic inspections examine specific issues. They don't necessarily assess every force, but they do examine in detail a particular aspect of police performance. For example, in the past, I've commissioned HMIC to look at the use of police stop and search powers and at the police response to domestic violence. These inspections are of huge importance because they allow us to shine a light on performance and they inform the work of the College of Policing to make sure performance is as good as it can be. Some of HMIC's thematic inspections are repeated each year. They're valuing the police programme reports each year on how forces are performing and coping with reduced budgets. This means it's possible to understand and compare public performance across the country. HMIC is already doing great work in making these inspections more transparent, and I recommend anybody with an interest in crime and policing in their community to visit their website. But the information is still detailed and complex and can be difficult to understand. Tom Windsor and HMIC are therefore developing proposals that will allow members of the public to see from a small number of easy-to-understand categories whether their local force is performing well or badly when it comes to cutting crime and providing value for money. These assessments should be made in just the same way as happens with the valuing the police work, through a combination of qualitative and quantitative research. But the conclusions need to become clearer. And if the new approach is successful, HMIC will consider whether it might be possible to extend it to cover other issues of public interest. I hope that that's been a pretty honest, warts and all analysis of where we are 1 year on since the first ever Police and Crime Commissioner elections. Overall, Police and Crime Commissioners are driving significant changes in policing. They are better known, more easily approached than the police authorities they replaced. They're delivering innovative reforms, and many are making use of their powers to hold their forces to account. To be frank, this is not the case across the board, and in some cases, Police and Crime Commissioners have been responsible for mistakes and errors of judgment, some possibly serious. But apart from where there are allegations of criminality, and those allegations are a matter for the IPCC, Police and Crime Commissioners will be accountable to their communities through the ballot box. And where the overall system needs to work better, for example, through improved information for the public about the performance of their local police, the government will do what it can to make things better. But I want to leave you with this thought. Despite significant budget cuts, police reform is working and crime is falling. Recorded crime has dropped by more than 10% under this government. The crime survey shows that crime stands at less than half its level of its peak in the 1990s and as it is at its lowest level since the survey began in 1981. Our opponents said you couldn't cut police spending without crime going up. They were proved wrong. They said police officer numbers couldn't go down without crime going up. They were proved wrong again. They said there was no need for police reform, and they were proved wrong yet again. Police reform is working, and thanks in part to elected police and crime commissioners, crime is falling. Thank you.
Thank you, Home Secretary. That was a very fair and balanced overview, I think, of the last 12 months, and a couple of new announcements in there that people might want to ask about as well. We've got a bit of time for some questions before you have to dash off to your next engagement, I think. So please, there's a roving mic's coming round. Please state your name and organisation. Please, questions on the speech and on PCCs as well. Bernard.
Home Secretary, Bernard Ricks from COPAC. The material that Policy Exchange have made available here includes a forward from yourself. It says, PCCs are far more open and transparent than police authorities ever were. Do you think PCCs have further to go than they currently have got on transparency?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it is for individual police and crime commissioners to think about what information they are providing to the public and what transparency they are providing. I think crucially the government has set the background. There's certain requirements within the legislation for what the police and crime commissioners need to publish in relation to certain aspects of expenditure. We've helped with the accountability in terms of the general accountability of the police in terms of the crime maps and the beat meetings. But obviously individual PCCs will want to look at the exchange of information they have with members of the public and how they're ensuring that members of the public know what is being done within the force and what they as the PCCs are doing. So I don't think there's more for us to say as a government, in a legislative sense, here we are mandating it. And this is part, in a sense, of localism, that individual PCCs will be thinking themselves about what they can do to showcase what is happening to the public.
Next question. Yes.
Hi, Lynette Nussbacher Associates. Your Permanent Secretary's annual performance is published in the Home Office Annual Report. And you have set some pretty serious goals for your police and crime commissioners and for their forces. Do you think that they should be publishing their chief constables' annual performance assessments for their constituents and for your constituents to read?
Well, they will be publishing in their plans and in their reports that they do publish annually a range of information about the performance of the force. And that is, the task of the Peace and Crime Commissioner is to hold the Chief Constable to account, and in doing that, they're holding, obviously, the force to account for what they do. So I think there is a significant amount of information already that comes out from the PCCs in relation to how the force is performing and how the Chief Constable is performing. We're also, as a government, by the way, requiring Chief Constables to start to publish a bit more information about issues like perks that they receive and things like that as part of our integrity agenda. So I think there is, but this is going to be a combination, because when it comes to the election, what the electorate are going to be looking at is the way that the Peace and Crime Commissioner has performed. Their record will obviously, there will be issues around how the force has performed, but you'll have a combination of information about the annual reports that come out from policing, about the policing plan and performance against the policing plan, together with HMIC's range of measures that they'll be publishing and the information that we will be looking and working with police forces to publish to make them more transparent about what they are doing. So I think that combination will come together into a very good mix of information for people when they come to the ballot box next time round.
Robert.
Home Secretary, as you know, some PCCs have been angling for devolution of more powers and more responsibilities that currently lie with central government, whereas some haven't been. And I wonder if you would be open to a sort of variable geometry in terms of piloting in some areas, perhaps, the devolution of more powers than you would in others. I'm thinking particularly of the request from the Mayor of London to have much wider criminal justice powers, including over probation, prosecution and the custodial services.
Well, first of all, the general concept of more powers going to police and crime commissioners is one that I favour. We're looking at it in a number of areas. They weren't just called police commissioners for a reason. They were called police and crime commissioners because of this concept that it is about holding the force to account, but actually they are a body that can bring together a number of agencies working in the area, working with the police, and a recognition that actually often dealing with prevention of crime particularly is about a wider set of agencies than just the police. And the PCCs, I think, are in a very good position to be able to bring people together and to deal with those areas. We've seen them being given powers in terms of commissioning victim services. For example, that's a new power that is being given to the PCCs. And I'm interested, I said I want to see what we could do to help deliver on some of the innovations that are being picked up by PCCs on the emergency services coming together. As regards the specific issue that you mentioned about prosecutions, though, it is not for politicians to be involved in prosecutions. Decisions about who should be charged and prosecuted and who should be investigated and arrested, this is a matter for the operational independence of the police. And decisions on prosecutions are taken obviously largely by the Independent Crown Prosecution Service. What we have done as a government is given police officers some more ability to take charging decisions without taking those to the CPS, and we're giving them more ability to run police-led prosecutions, which I hope as part of the reform of the criminal justice system is both about, those two things are both about the individual discretion and professional judgment of police officers and enhancing that, but it's also about more efficiency through the criminal justice system. But there may be other areas where police and crime commissioners will come to us and say, this is an issue that we think it would be useful to have a power for. And certainly I'm not averse to piloting in certain areas if that's what seems sensible to see whether something works. But I think there are some good developments already in terms of how we can take their work, enhance the work that they're doing at local level.
Okay, next question. Gentleman there.
Hi, Jamie Grierson at the Press Association. I just have a question about the HMIC proposals in two parts. First of all, what criteria would you like to see police forces' performance to be measured against? For example, number of burglaries in an area are coming down, for example. And secondly, how can you be sure that the performance ratings won't effectively be applied as another target? And how can you be sure that the proposals aren't effectively targets by stealth?
Well, it's a very good, first of all, it's not for me to tell HMIC what sort of measures they should be looking at and publishing. I've set an overall aim for policing of cutting crime, And I think in terms, obviously I'm keen that people are able to see whether how their force is performing in terms of cutting crime and in terms of the value for money that they're giving to members of the public. But obviously HMIC themselves will be looking at how they measure different things, and they already provide quite a lot of information. As I say, I think it's about making some simpler information available to members of the public. But you're right to challenge on the second point. I mean, there is always a question when you provide information as to whether people will pick that up and somehow use that as a target against which to operate. Now, that part of that, I think, is a part of the role for the PCCs to be working with their chief constables and forces in relation to how they are prioritising what they do in a local area, and to make sure that actually you don't suddenly see targets being introduced, those being used as targets by stealth. I've made a comment about targets that are being introduced by PCCs in my speech, because as you'll have seen from the fact that I abolished the national targets, I think we have to allow at that local level an understanding of what is happening at the local level and where prioritisation needs to be. What happened previously with all the national targets, and you know, my local police used to say this to me, we're trying to meet the national targets, but I know that a certain type of crime is more prevalent here, or is more the issue that matters to local people in this area. But if I don't focus on what the national target is, then I don't get a tick in the box. I get the reverse. The localism of the Police and Crime Commissioners enables that local prioritisation to take place, and that's why their role is so important.
Lady at the back.
Hello, my name is Lily Evans from Northumbria Associates. I wanted to ask each one of the commissioners what were the main lessons that they've learned in this year.
Well, we're going to come on to that next. So
They're going to be on a panel, so you'll have an opportunity to ask them questions.
another question behind. Thank you.
Home Secretary, I just wanted to ask a very quick question about Ahmed Mohammed and the whereabouts of his passport. Why is it that you were so badly briefed on the whereabouts of his passport? You've asked to change your answer because you said there were some inaccuracies. Could I ask why you were briefed so badly on that?
I did receive information that I gave to the House of Commons earlier this week on Monday in my statement that was not correct. I have corrected that information in the appropriate way. It's been corrected in Hansard. He was not when he came back into the UK, he was not in possession of a passport, so the police were not able to take his passport. But that has been corrected in the way in which is appropriate, which is both writing to the Member of Parliament who asked the question, who happens to be the chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee, and also correcting Hansard. I have already said I was given a certain briefing. I used that briefing in the House. It then transpired that that briefing was not correct, and I've done what is necessary and appropriate and right and proper for Parliament, which is to correct that publicly through Hansard.
Can I ask you a question on PCCs and whether you think this is a model that's yet proven itself to be one that might be extended to other areas of public services? So is it too early to say whether we could end up with health commissioners or education commissioners locally batting for the public and providing that accountability?
Well, I look forward to Policy Exchange promoting that as a report and so forth. I think I believe that police and crime commissioners are proving their value and showing their worth. And I think that it is very interesting that we've got it in an area perhaps where people would naturally have said it was not the easiest area to introduce that directly elected individuals. But we've been able to do it and to show that local responsibility and the local voice without damaging, without encroaching on the operational independence of the police, which is so important. But there may be, and there are other areas, of course, where accountability has changed. I mean, there are parts of the UK now that have the directly elected mayors, for example, rather than just the local authorities. So the landscape has been changing in a number of ways. But as I say, I look forward to the Policy Exchange report on how far this might go.
Danny.
Well, I indicated within my speech, I referred to a number of cases that had required investigation in relation to PCCs, and I think that would have been a sufficient answer to your question, Danny.
How would you have to minimise those mistakes?
Well, the whole point about police and crime commissioners is that it's not always for government to be interfering and telling them what to do. The point about police and crime commissioners is they are responsible to their electorates. There are processes in place, absolutely appropriate processes in place, in relation to consideration by the IPCC of issues which need to be, which are of a nature that require that sort of investigation. And it's right and proper that we have that in place. But crucially, the accountability of PCCs is to their electorates, and it is for their electorates to decide on the quality of job that they are doing.
Take one more question. Yes, lady at the front.
Thank you. Christine Stevens from Capita. I've got two questions, actually. First of all, could you tell us a little bit more about the ACPO reforms? And do you anticipate that the responsibilities held by chief constables on ACPO will pass to the policing college? And secondly, a little bit about how you might spread best practice between the PCCs so that we in the supply chain don't suffer a fragmented market and there isn't a slowdown of decision making as we get up towards the next election.
On the first point that you raised, the investigation, the review that is taking place in relation to ACPO was actually initiated by the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. And they've commissioned somebody to undertake that review. It is ongoing, and obviously the results, I'm sure, will be made public when that has been presented to the PCCs. But you asked about whether the roles of chief constables in ACPO moves to the college. Of course, a large amount of what ACPO used to do has moved to the college. And these days, people used to talk about the ACPO lead and like this and the ACPO lead on that. Now it is a national policing lead under the College of Policing. So if anybody wants to know what the policing guidance on policing in a particular area is, if anybody wants to know if an incident has occurred, what a policing response would be beyond the immediate response in the area, it's the College of Policing that they should go to. And in case anybody doesn't know, the Chief Executive, Chief Constable Alex Marshall, is sitting here in the audience today. So the College of Policing has taken on that role of developing, but is enhancing it and improving it in a way that I think is crucial. I sometimes say to people, for an organisation that depends for its success, if you like, in terms of dealing with criminals on evidence, it is strange that over the years, policing has not developed a greater body of evidence of what works in policing. The college is doing that. The college is looking across all areas and will continue to evolve this in terms of what is actually best practice in policing. And we'll be disseminating that, obviously, across police forces. Now, you then asked about the best practice of the police and crime commissioners. And in a sense, I mean, part of the work is, I mean, there are two elements that identify the best practice in a sense. First of all, in terms of anything that involves the sort of management of the force and value for money and so forth. Obviously, HMIC inspections show what is happening in any particular force, and you're able to, and as I've said, in future, be able to probably compare slightly better on that. And then in terms of actually what happens in policing terms and how effective that is for the College of Policing to determine. Now, I can't answer your the last point that you made. I'm afraid politicians are politicians, and coming up to elections, obviously people have to look, and there are certain protocols that apply in relation to contract signing and so forth in very close up to elections. As you'll be aware, those apply at local government and national government level as well. But I think what we're developing with the College of Policing, with the HMIC reports, with the transparency agenda, is a much greater body of best practice and evidence of best practice that can then be picked up, that can then be shared amongst the various police forces and amongst the police and crime commissioners.
Thank you. Thank you for taking so many questions, and thank you for joining us and for giving us such a great overview of the last 12 months. So if we could thank the Home Secretary in the usual way. Right, so we're going to go straight into a panel discussion with the three PCCs who are with me on stage. They're going to give us their reflections on their first year in office and talk a bit about the challenges facing the police service and how their new leadership is going, hopefully, to help the service to succeed. So first of all, on my immediate left, we've got Chris Salmon, who's the PCC for Dyfed Powys. Chris served as an officer in the Rifles in Northern Ireland, Kosovo and Iraq before pursuing a career in business and in politics, and he was also the Conservative candidate for Llanelli in the 2010 election. Chris also wrote an essay for the book, which focuses primarily on how PCCs can re-engage the public with the business of policing. Next, we'll have Adam Simmonds. Adam is the PCC for Northamptonshire. He's held a variety of roles in national and local politics, including working in Parliament, most recently as Head of Strategy and Business Administration for Northamptonshire County Council. And as the Home Secretary said, Adam's been very vocal in calling for greater integration between emergency services, which is one of the themes of his piece in our book. And then finally, we'll hear from Vera Baird, who's the PCC for Northumbria. Vera was a Labour MP, as many of you will know, between 2001 and 2010, and served as Solicitor General under Gordon Brown. And before entering Parliament, she was a barrister specialising in civil liberties and human rights law, I think. And she's done a lot of work to campaign against violence against women, which is also the main topic of her essay. So, Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much. I thought I'd start with a reflection. My first, one of my most vivid memories of the election took place, funnily enough, not far from here at the Royal United Services Institute. They were holding an event on the strategic future of policing. And I was invited to the panel, and it turned out, as the person introducing me tactfully announced to everybody, the reason I was invited was that nobody knew where Dyfed Powys was, still less could they pronounce it. It's not bad. That there was very unlikely to be anybody in the room from Dyfed Powys, and there was even less chance of my winning. And therefore, there was no danger of anybody accusing them of interfering in the electoral process. And I made a couple of observations on that panel about why I was interested in the role of Police and Crime Commissioner and why I was standing. And I drew on some experience from my previous career in the military, particularly from my experiences in Iraq. Now, military and police are very different animals, and quite rightly so. But one of the observations you'll generally get from soldiers when they're fighting wars is if politicians would get out the way, they could get on and win them. The observation that I took from Basra was actually the opposite, that the failures we were experiencing were largely a result of the fact that holders of elected high office, if you like, were not gripping their professional leads. They didn't have sufficient grip on the strategic direction of what we're doing, and the result was drift and confusion that I was experiencing as a very junior officer. And I suggested that some of the same might apply, some of those same challenges might apply to policing at that time, and that there was perhaps a quiet crisis of confidence that was reflected in headlines, which at the time were all around Hillsborough. We hadn't yet had Plebgate. At the high level and at the grassroots level, if you like, by the sense for Mrs. Jones doing her shopping in the morning that the police weren't quite on her side in the way that they used to be. I have to say it didn't go down enormously well with the chief constables in the room at the time, but nothing I have seen since has challenged that view, and if anything, it's frankly enhanced it. My arrival in my office, I can have these visions, this vision of this collection of rather startled-looking staff. I might as well have arrived from Mars, I think, the idea of an elected politician turning up in the middle of police governance. But I was very clear about what I wanted to do. I wanted a police force that was focused on fighting crime and not chasing figures, that was spent money more wisely and that worked with others, public sector, voluntary sector, business better, and a force that people can trust. And that's what's driven everything that I've done since. And just to quickly reflect on some of the challenges and opportunities, if you like, I think that there's lots you'll hear, there's lots that police and crime commissioners can do in the wider agenda of, as the Home Secretary described, and crime, joining up agencies and commissioning and so on. I want to focus just on a very simple principle, and that is that what we can do, because the public hold the keys to our job, is bring a relentless and unremitting focus to this public service onto the public and public need, and put the public at the heart of everything that we do. And that is something that I've been repeating, a message I've been repeating endlessly over the last year. Part of that is bringing greater transparency. And transparency has two parts. There's the part that I'm experiencing now, which is you looking at me on the stage as an elected Police and Crime Commissioner and challenging me on my thinking. The other part is internal transparency. And perhaps one of the things that surprised me most, and was one of the biggest challenges I faced, was getting a grip on decisions, internal decisions, how they were made, who was responsible for them, where money lay, was it being properly accounted for, all that kind of stuff. And so it's consumed a huge proportion of my attention in the last 12 months, just getting a better grip on internal decision makings to deliver quicker decisions and better decisions for the organisation. So all those wonderful guys who are struggling on the front line to deliver get what they need quicker, and allows me as the person publicly accountable for policing to answer for decisions that I at least know how they're being made and why they're being made. In the past, you've got these decisions sort of, it's a bit like an iceberg. There's a whole decision-making machinery below the surface, and every now and again a decision would float to the top, and you'd be presented with it to sign, and that was it. And that's obviously no form of real accountability. The thrust of what we're doing, and the great opportunity for us in Dyfed Powys, is to respond to a particular need that we face. We are the largest police force area in England and Wales, about half of Wales, an area I'm told the size of Lebanon, with slightly better crime figures, you'll be pleased to know. And yet 500,000 people. And we face all of the same problems in terms of crime that everybody faces. We have drugs, we have people trafficking children, and we have problems with domestic violence, we have problems with antisocial behaviour. The challenge, we don't have that in the volume that our major conurbations have them. The challenge we have is how do you deliver policing services that reassure people, that protect vulnerable people living in remote communities, that encourage people to report domestic violence when they're living on a farm that's 5 miles from anybody else. How do you deliver those services for your public? And that's something that my Chief Constable, who's picked up what's not called, it's National Lead now, isn't it? The National Lead for Rural Policing is very keen to pursue, and it's something that I'm very keen to pursue, and it is, if you like, the theme of what we are doing. And that opportunity is available to us now because I am responsible to the people who voted for me, the people of Dyfed Powys. We don't have to jump to the target set in Whitehall, and we can, and I'm very hopeful that we will, become the go-to people on rural policing in England and Wales. That's what I want to do, and I very much hope that we can build relationships with local academic institutions around that. We're already in some discussions, and seed, if you like, a centre of excellence and some thinking around it. And that's the opportunity that's been presented to me as the first person to be elected in this particular part of the world to meet particular challenges for the place that I come from. Just to quickly glance to the future, I think a lot of what I want to do, we've already started doing in terms of, there's a clear focus on the public in how we provide access to our policing services and how we respond to their concerns and reassurance. I think we're saving money already by the very introduction of police and crime commissioners and restructuring that we're undertaking. And we have a relentless focus on standards and professionalism and the importance of making sure that people can have confidence in their police, which thankfully, by and large, in 99% of the time, they do. In terms of the future, I do think there's a lot of merit in what's been proposed from the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime in terms of joining up agencies and the wider criminal justice system. I think it's already happening quite a lot, actually, with police and crime commissioners around the country. There's certainly things we can do to a degree that we're already exploring in our part of the world. Again, the big challenge being rurality. I think that would be made easier with a wider sort of purview. And I would leave you with the one sort of wider thought, which I think you touched on, Max, at the end, which is that the simple power of direct accountability to refocus and redirect energies, public sector energies, into delivering the needs of the public, that has been applied to the police through police and crime commissioners, might well be a model worth considering for wider parts of the public sector, not least local authorities. But on that, I'll leave it.
Thank you. Adam.
Hi, good morning. I've been asked many times over this last year, why did you stand to be a police and crime commissioner? And I have actually thought that probably every day for the last 12 months. And I guess why I'm asked that is because people have this idea, you know, you must have woken up one day and thought you want to be you run the police service. I never really thought much about the police service before taking on this job beyond being just an ordinary member of the public. But I got to a point in my life, just very honestly, at about 35, which feels like a lifetime ago, it was only a year ago, and I thought I wanted to do something bigger and different, and here was an opportunity that no one's ever done before, and why not go for it? So really just that very straightforward, something new, something big. And I understood the job to be pretty much this at the time, and now it's, you know, it's huge. And I know Gordon Wasman's in the audience. He knew that it was this big, but only ever sold it as this big. So I hold him personally responsible. But it was the very early weeks of driving somewhere for a sort of like a counter-terrorism briefing for the first time, very exciting, going somewhere and getting a phone call in the car, hands-free, I point out, that a farmer had had his sheep slaughtered that evening, and what was I going to do about it? And it's kind of like that perspective and that spectrum of, you know, policing versus that local, you know, you're my representative, what are you going to do about it? And I think we probably all experience that in different ways, and it's kind of that bizarre thing, what am I going to do about it? For me, the job of Police and Crime Commissioner is fantastic. It is a real privilege to get elected and do this job and work within a sector that is dedicated to making things better for people. I've not met a police officer at all who isn't dedicated to wanting to make their communities safer and better. There are different ways of doing that, and I have a different vision of what the future looks like. I've been classed as mad as a box of frogs for some of the things that I have talked about, i.e. bringing the fire service and the police service together. There are some people in this country who think they are already together, which is, I have a sort of an argument with people when they realise they're not, and those people who don't want to see them come together as well. I've not really gone into the world of the ambulance service. I think joining one public service with another is more than enough to be getting on with for the time being. But there are huge challenges, and some of that isn't actually to do with the police per se. It is the rest of the criminal justice system, and I know the Home Secretary touched on that a bit. And I think the future for us has to be within that context and within that world. What the probation service, the Crown Prosecution Service, youth offending, prisons, even the health service, what role do they play in the whole picture? And I'm very privileged to now be the chairman of the local criminal justice board for Northamptonshire, and I chaired my first meeting 2 weeks ago. And that is just in itself, the PCC being in that room and chairing that meeting is a significant step forward. We're still trying to work out what holding people to account looks like in terms of the Crown Prosecution Service, but I'm not really interested in having people arrested and having people prosecuted. I do think accountability is possible without stepping on anyone else's toes in terms of their operational independence. After all, that's what police and crime commissioners have now demonstrated, I hope, over the last 12 months, that police officers, chief constables can get on with their day-to-day job and not have anyone stepping on their operational toes, and yet still be involved in setting the strategy for where the force needs to be. So I think that's possible. I think CPS and probation and others, we will get there. Our role already is involved a bit more now with the probation service and the changes in that system. I'm pretty philosophical about it. The change is going to happen. I'm not arguing the merits of privatisation or anything. We just need to get on with it and make the best of it for those who work within the system as well as those who are customers of it. I think one of the biggest challenges for me, and I don't know if everyone in this room is from London, but outside of London, police and crime commissioners' roles are very similar in that we all have a huge geographical area. We're not responsible for a council, and there's a whole range of services we can't really talk about, although they do impact on us. And it's really having that opportunity to prove ourselves, I guess, to everyone else, that we are not mad and we know what we're doing. And also just that sort of benefit of the doubt that 4 years from now, things will be better, things will be different. We will have demonstrated. The challenge of the first 12 months is that so much is still up in the air. We've come in, we've built reputations, hopefully good ones. We have started to build a relationship with our chief and his team and with the force. Through April and May of this year, I met with 2,500 of our employees in 26 sessions, 100 or so at a time, saying, hello, I'm sorry for some of the things we did in the first day or two, and announced, in my case, we're moving out of the HQ building. It's been there 100 years, how dare you come in first day, get us out of this building. But those kind of conversations are really important. Blow away some myths, understand where I'm coming from, understand that my ambition is to do good. And that takes time. And that takes a lot of shifts out at night in some of our our worst areas on a shift for 6 hours, just talking to police officers, and they understand what they go. I understand what they go through, etc. And that has taken time. But for me, 2014-15 is the delivery 2 years. I want to merge 2 public services together and do it with the trade union support. Watch this space. I'm going to hopefully launch in May an Institute for Police and Crime and Justice, which is about that evidence base, building an institute which is going to start working with the college particularly on building an evidence-based research innovation. And also, September 2017, we're going to open a school on the HQ site that I currently operate out of. And it's going to be a new free school with a whole new aspiration of what's going to be delivered on that. These are things that are not in my police and crime plan particularly, or were not in my manifesto, but these are things in the last 12 months I kind of think, I can't do this without doing this, and I can't do this without that happening. And you can start to realise that the role grows by just the very nature of your ambition. I'm one of the offenders who has set my police force a target, and the Home Secretary was very polite not mentioning it, but I've only set one, which is to reduce violent crime by 40%. And the reason for that is that in this year of learning, the previous target was about 3.5% reduction. Violent crime went up by 5.5%. Their ambition was to reduce it by 3.5%. And violent crime in Northamptonshire per head was just as bad as London, Merseyside and Greater Manchester. And anyone who's ever been to Northamptonshire, you won't know. You just drive through Northamptonshire. But it is not that kind of a place. And so setting an ambition of 40% really was, are you serious? 40%? It means we're actually going to have to, do something. We have to reduce violent crime. Not because they didn't want to, but because the ambition had never been set. And I'm a big believer in standing up at a podium and say, you're going to do this, we're going to do this. Because I think that is sometimes half the battle. Once the support is there, the ambition is set, everything else can come together. Famously, John F. Kennedy, he stood in front of cameras in 1962 and said America would send a man to the moon and return him safely to the Earth. Had no idea how much it was going to cost at the time or how to do it. But by the end of the decade, they'd done it. So that motivation, I think, is really important. So my role, if anything, in this last 12 months has been about understanding the job, understanding what the ambition level needs to be, setting those hairs running, if you like, and working with the chief to build a reputation and credibility to deliver the kind of change that I think is necessary.
Thanks, Adam. Vera.
Why I wanted to be a police and crime commissioner. Actually, my most driving ambition was to stand for election in order to change the balance of power away from the police and toward the public. That, I think, is attainable because of the grip that the Police and Crime Commissioner has on the budget and on the ability to dismiss the Chief Constable. And I think that is a very key piece of importance about police and crime commissioners, and that policing governance being very democratic is almost higher in importance than any other kind of governance, because the police have the most enormous powers over you and me, and they also have an organizational structure that you may say almost by its nature is inevitably inward-looking and defensive, and the public interest is seen to be served by the police, and so it's very easy for the police to think that what they say is ethically correct, even actually, if it's defensive about themselves, is ethically correct. So I think that was a very interesting thing to look at as a person ambitious to be a police and crime commissioner. And I think that there has been a significant power shift in the direction of the public through these elected bodies. I want to say that actually I get on extremely well with my police. My Chief Constable and I, luckily, do work well. She is very outward-looking. She is very responsive to scrutiny. She is very interested in the integration with the public that she feels, as I do, gives the power, the legitimacy, and the ability to the police service. So when I refer to the police juggernaut of power, I'm not speaking particularly about Northumbria, but about the right position, I think, for the public control over the police to be in. Historically, I've worked as a criminal barrister, and so over the last 30 years or so, I have seen the police in court and out of court at their worst and at their best. And I think that the public should have somebody leading scrutiny who comes from that kind of detachment, but of course informed detachment after 30 years being involved with the criminal justice system. I think what historically happened is that the public would want to give priorities to the police, probably through particular pressure group, asking for something that was very important, and the police would be ready to take it on, and so would be open, but they would slide it into their original ladder of priorities at the place where they wanted it to be, and nothing actually would have changed, except perhaps they knew a little bit more, they gave it a little bit more priority. But now, if I say, really what we need to do, because there was a dreadful case about this, which your police simply didn't handle well, is to introduce some different training along this particular line, then it will happen. And the public are pleased, I think, that that will happen. I speak, as my colleagues, with legitimacy, because we were elected. And although the turnout was poor, most of us got pretty sizable majorities within the areas where we were. And I did myself get elected on first vote. So I feel that there's a certain amount of power already behind me. But furthermore, that it is my role to build up my visibility, which goes with the legitimacy, and that process is occurring reasonably as well. But I don't get ever confused that my role is as the public's representative with the police. I'm not the police representative to the public. What I must do is make sure that the police do what the public want them to do. And for instance, there have been two, quite good examples of this. On one occasion, my local police force did not return an escaped person from a mental hospital who had a bad criminal record and an even worse nickname, which should have told them in the first place to get a move on. They did not, and the public were quite concerned because this person was dangerous, he was at large. In fact, absolutely nothing happened, and the police in the end brought him back. But I did a review of that, how that had happened, and I published my findings. I gave them first of all to the Chief Constable, but I published them in the paper, together with the changes that she'd brought, because I'd given them to her first, about how such an event would be dealt with better in the future. So that I think the public were aware that there was somebody who'd listened to their concerns, who had tackled the police about it, brought about change, and then we could go forward in quite a positive way, the police and I working together. Another thing which I dealt with slightly differently was that our record on getting complaints right, and we're far from unique about this, is not brilliant. Quite a large proportion, 53% last year, was successfully appealed to the IPCC after we deliberated about them. Now, I looked at 78, that was the 53% was made up of 78 complaints, and I read each and every one of them to come to a conclusion about what was going wrong, and I did. And again, I put together a report about that, but this time I thought the right thing was just to give it to the Chief Constable so that she had an opportunity to work out for herself, obviously with my input, how to bring change. And we will have a significantly different complaint system in course of the next few months from much of that. And I feel that the discretion I exercised, one, to make something public that they'd got wrong and reassure the public, two, to deliberately not do so while she was given an opportunity to improve, since she was ready to do so. They were the right decisions. I think, having mentioned legitimacy and now want to mention visibility, whereas the police authorities were not well known about, I am now visible, as we all are, through the electoral history itself, through some of the mistakes that Theresa's talked about, none of them made by us, I have to say, but nonetheless, upping the awareness. And there is no doubt at all that the public are now very aware that there is a single, accountable, visible figure. And that isn't just making me visible, it is also professionalising the scrutiny of the police. The committee of aldermen, as it were, who amounted to the police authority, no quibble with their well-intentioned nature, but they weren't in any way particularly prioritising the police. Many of them didn't know a lot about the police. The few that did were around with a great committee of people who didn't. Now, I mean, I'm visible. I have to be absolutely professional. And so my whole focus is on the police, and it is known that that visible presence has their entire focus on it. I can, of course, also make quick decisions, and I am visible to the other agencies who I can call on. For instance, my chapter in the book is about predatory men in the nighttime economy. If any of you have ever been in the Northeast, you'll know that Newcastle has what I'm going to diplomatically call a vibrant nighttime economy. It's beset, as all nighttime economies are, by people looking for folk who are going to get vulnerable through drink and other things, so that they can be beset. Girls for vulnerable for sexual abuse, boys too, stealing phones, stealing mobile phones, stealing wallets. There was a dreadful case in Newcastle in which the door staff of a club put a young girl out because she was drunk. And although I think he thought he'd gone the extra mile because he tried to take her to a taxi, she was falling around. Another person came in to help him hold her up. When the lad felt he had to go back to his club, the other man said he would take her on. He was the rapist, and he raped her, and he passed her on to 2 other people. And it became very, very clear that there had to be a different approach from door staff. But perhaps even worse is that after the first man had had sex with this young woman, the public drew it to the attention of a couple of police officers who looked at the 2 of them. The boy managed to convince the police that he was taking her home, that they were in a relationship. She was very drunk. She put her arms around his neck. Nobody would have taken her seriously in any other way, but it seemed to satisfy the police that, in fact, they were in a relationship. Of course, the real position at law is that anybody who's drunk, as she plainly was, cannot consent to sex. So prima facie, they were told about a rape, but they didn't seem to know that. So I was able to call together, I was able to say to the police, who were ready, teach the door staff how to deal with this. And they said, yes, we will. But then because of my public, visible position, I was able to say, and you need to learn as well about how your officers deal with an issue like this, which could be very, very worrying. On the other hand, if you can have a conversation with the people of a discriminating kind, perhaps you can say, actually, it's not a worry at all. So we called together the police, the local authority safeguarding, the licensing, Tyneside rape crisis, women's aid, everyone you can think of to come together. And we put together a piece of training for the police, complementary for the Security Industry Authority. And now, nationally, it's been taken on, and every member of door staff now has to be trained in a component of safeguarding to look after vulnerable people in the nighttime economy. They're not to be put out. They're to be safeguarded somewhere until some assistance can be brought. And I have to say, the Home Secretary was excellent in seeing the deficiency in this training, both from the police point of view and the SIA, and in pushing it. I don't think a committee-based, part-time group of a police authority could conceivably have moved so quickly to produce that kind of sea change. So we've had a lot to do, and we have done our individual enterprises, our individual stuff going forward. Where are we now? Very, very quickly, we're a political reality until 2016 at the very least. So we need to be worked with, and we need not only to do our job, but to look forward and say, is it as good as it can get? I think there is no going back on democracy now. Should there be less individualism? Hasn't it been to some extent beset by the problem of a one-to-one ballet pas de deux with the chief constable, some very inappropriate ballerinas in there sometimes? Is there a case for a bigger group of people instead of a one-to-one? I don't know, but that might enhance democracy. There's a bit of a democratic deficit implicit because at least, 1/3 of the police authorities were elected. So when they sampled the police complaint system to check them out, they were doing it on behalf of the public. If people from my office do it now, they're no more democratic than anyone else. So there is something of a democratic deficit there. On the other hand, the reach if we're going to keep this structure, does need to extend, in my view. I think that if we're to give budgets and we're going to take responsibility for all the ramifications of our police and crime planning, community safety planning, developing diversionary activities, we need really to be in charge of community safety as well as just the police. And I also think that we do have to look at what practical role, not in the slightest usurping judicial independence, we can play in the criminal justice process too. Because much of my public consultation says to me, we like the police, but we worry what happens when people go to court, whether victims are really looked after in a way that they should be. Could I say one last thing that neither of my colleagues has picked up on? We are, I think, beginning to develop a collective political voice as police and crime commissioners. And that's a very interesting question going forward about how that goes on. I know that 5, I think all Conservatives, have written to the Home Secretary about cuts and the impact on their forces now, and they are right and bold and proper to do so, and they are a voice that must be heard. Every one of us wrote about tagging. I don't know what would have happened to that Ahmed guy if the Home Secretary had responded properly to our letter about tagging, but there was a voice there, and it will get bigger. There's a big campaign launched by one police and crime commissioner, taken up by many, about retaining proceeds of crime in one's own area. After all, it's our police who get the money. Why should it go, as we put it in Newcastle, south? half of it stays, half of it goes south. So there's a big campaign there, and there are a lot of other things that we can do together, and we can, I think, cross-party. It works quite reasonably so far. I think everyone would agree. Here is perhaps a strong new political voice that needs to be taken account of in some way, which we should develop as well. So here we are, the pioneers, but also we have to build on what's already there and try to take it positively forward, because I'm pretty sure, I don't often say this, I agree with the Tory Home Secretary. There's no going back on democracy now.
Thank you, Vera. Before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to ask 2 very quick questions. One relating to your last point, Vera, about the political voice, and I wanted to ask perhaps Chris and Adam about your relationships with MPs, because it strikes me that you've got big majorities in areas where obviously MPs exist too. How's that been, and how do you see that developing? And then quickly to Vera as well. Democracy's out of the genie's out of the bottle, and we've had various Labour MPs writing very positively for the book as well. Do you detect at a sort of national level a softening in the Labour position on the whole question of directly elected PCCs? So if we start with,
I mean, the relationship with MPs is, it's good. I mean, we clearly, they're a conduit for complaints in some cases. They clearly have a view on policing and crime in their areas. I think it's a very important relationship on lots of levels. But we're very different animals to MPs. And I think one of the interesting observations about us as political animals, people tend to sort of see is there a sort of competition there? And actually, there's a couple of things that make us fundamentally different. The first is that ours is an executive rather than a legislative role, and as a result, we make our names. We stand or fall by whether or not we deliver against what we say we're going to deliver, and we have a budget to do it, and we have tax-raising powers to fund that budget, and we have priority-setting powers to direct people's energies. So, if you like, there's not much to be gained by carping across a boundary at a Peace and Crime Commissioner of a different political persuasion and saying, they're getting it wrong, look at me, aren't I better? Actually, because someone turns around and says, well, why aren't you doing it yourself? So it changes the nature of the political animal, that we are executive rather than, as I say, representative people. And I think that in part accounts for the fact that there's pretty strong relationships. I'm not aware of a particularly party political pattern emerging. And so we're very different from MPs on that basis, and our relationship is primarily one of it's an important conduit for communication, really.
So I have 7 members of Parliament. I don't really hear from them through Monday through Thursday. Friday, when they're all back in the constituency, is a bit more busy. I get a lot of their casework gets just sent straight to us, or Michael, who's sitting there. We kind of have to work our way through some of those. And I think, you're just picking up on that point that Chris made about the executive versus the legislative. You know, we've probably all sat in rooms in a similar scenario with an MP talking about, I'm putting a bill forward or I'm writing, you know, and actually my frustration is, well, we're actually doing it. So there's that kind of element to the power, we get to do stuff. And we've got money to do it with. So even if it may be less of it, we have money available to use. So I kind of think MPs have a very different role to us. They're very useful in terms of getting an argument put forward. But the benefit is that we have direct access to ministers. So I don't need to go through people. And that's, you know, I think that's very, very helpful. So I think what we're working out across the country of all these elected roles is we all have very different parts to play. Any challenge I'd like to give my members of Parliament is to understand what we do more, what the police service does, what the problems are around the criminal justice system, that they could be very helpful with perhaps, you know, making the case in the House of Commons about making changes legislative to help us. Certainly the issue around the fire service, when I announced in February that I was going to merge the fire service and the police service, one of our local MPs said I was bananas and, you know, I'd not delivered on the police yet, so why would I want to take that on? It's kind of like misunderstanding why we would want to do that, the narrative of why that is important. And maybe that's my responsibility to communicate better about what that's about. But I think MPs have an opportunity to understand our role more, and I think we've probably not created that environment yet to have that conversation.
Very briefly on the Labour position, and then we'll have some questions.
I quite agree with what Adam's just said. I mean, the MPs in my party were pretty half-hearted about the whole PCC thing and didn't take a lot of notice of the event because of that, albeit, you know, they did get their constituency parties to help me. There was no doubt about the campaign. But it was hard to get onto their agenda. So I've concentrated on making sure that they know what I'm doing, and I send a lot of information to them. There's been a lot to do, and political engagement of that kind could not have been the most important thing, but I am about to recruit as many of my MPs as I can to that campaign about proceeds of crime that I've mentioned, because obviously it's moving money away from their territory just as much as it's moving away from mine. So I'm hoping for stronger, better relationships, but it's been about communication so far.
Questions? Yes, down the front. We'll aim to wrap up in about 10 minutes' time.
Lynette Nussbacher Associates. I have a question for all of you, but I'm going to particularly direct it at Mr. Salmon because he comes from the black button mafia in the army. And that is, the army has got a concept of officership, and the police do not. And people have observed that some people have observed that the police suffer from a lack of the idea of people with a particular ethos running the show. Do you, as those to whom those senior coppers answer, think after a year's experience that there is such an officership ethos or ethical deficit?
Yes, is there a problem with leadership and culture within the police? Yes, I think there is. I think it's being addressed in a number of ways at the moment by the College of Policing and by the range of reforms that are taking place across the policing landscape. Do I think the police should have an officer class and a Sandhurst type arrangement? No, I don't. I think there is a fundamental difference between the job of policing and the job of the army, and there's a very deliberate reason why rank structures are different and organisations are different, going all the way back to the foundation of the police service. So I don't think that that officer class type approach in the police is appropriate, but I think there is certainly a case for trying to acquire some of its benefits, if you like, and inject that into the leadership of the police. So I do think accelerated promotion and direct entry are going to be valuable tools in breaking open the culture and introducing different leadership. And I think the same is true of foreign chief constables when that comes along. I think it's the direction, everything we must do must be about breaking open closed cultures. And I think that's the fundamental problem. It is a cultural problem and it's a leadership problem.
Next question, Robert.
I was particularly interested in what Chris was saying about your description of yourself as a political animal, because I think one of the things that was regrettable when the government was proposing PCCs was the extent to which they said that they won't be political. I mean, obviously, it's right that policing shouldn't be partisan or party political and sort of political with a capital P, but many of the decisions that you're taking are political with a small p. They're about allocation of resources, they're about what we prioritise. They are competing political questions. You can't take the politics out of them, or to the extent that you do, all that happens is those decisions, those political decisions, end up being taken by people who are unaccountable. So I think that was regrettable, but with that in mind, I'd want to ask particularly Vera Baird the same thing that I asked the Home Secretary about prosecution. Because as a former Solicitor General, you'll know that the Crown Prosecution Service is autonomous, but it is accountable through the Attorney General, and the Attorney General doesn't involve himself in prosecution decisions, except in one or two cases where there is a statutory responsibility to do so. And I wonder, given that we have regional prosecutors, whether or not the same sort of arrangement might not stand as already stands between PCCs and the operational independence of the police. That is to say that they should be accountable, they could perhaps appoint people, they could perhaps set priorities, but obviously respecting the operational independence of prosecutorial services, because that seems to be where you were going when you were talking about the wider criminal justice system.
Actually, that wasn't particularly where I was going. I was thinking about, we're going to have a scheme of observing the court process a little bit, because we have to commission for victims and witnesses presently, and so it's good to get to know how they're treated, and it was in that territory that I was going. I certainly have nothing at all against more scrutiny of the Crown Prosecution Service. Whether you need to make some different structure and whether it is easy to do, granted their need for independence, and the whole point of their rationale was that the investigators over whom we have governance are not the people who take the decision for prosecuting. It would be quite odd, I think, to reconnect them, as it were, through us. But scrutiny is very good. I mean, there is a scrutiny panel in my area which looks at the way they deal with particular kinds of case. It looks at closed, failed cases, rape, domestic violence, hate crime, crime against disabled people, and it is members of the public looking at that and making, powerful recommendations about lessons to be learned. I think that's only good, and we're going to bring that back into police. So we will look at failed police files in particular kinds of case similarly, but I'm not sure that I want to be that kind of rejoining of police and CPS at all. I don't think that's a good idea.
So can I jump in there? I'm starting from the point of view that the way we've been working hasn't worked. So the criminal justice system isn't a system, for a start, and why isn't it a service? Why isn't the victim of crime at the centre of the system or this service? Why is the offender? Why are we having the conversation about making people who are responsible for delivering justice more accountable to the people in which they're supposed to be serving? And the reason for that is we live with the law, but justice is harder to achieve. And it's more complicated. So chairing the Criminal Justice Board last 2 weeks ago, for me, sat there with the Chief Crown Prosecutor and the Chief Executive of the Probation Service and the head of 3 or 4 prisons in our area, how are we together going to deliver a better criminal justice service for the people of Northamptonshire? The problem is, Chief Crown Prosecutor is East Midlands based. So he has all sorts of different other people. That's got to be, where do I put the stake in the ground and say, we here in Northamptonshire want this level of service. We want to understand how you're going to improve reoffending, or reduce reoffending rather. All of that matters, and who's absorbing that space or arguing for that? So I'm not interested in how many people we prosecute per se and getting involved in that. In the same way, I'm not telling the Chief Constable to arrest people, but I am saying what you do for a living has to be better, and you have to have more accountability in the local area for what you do, because people pay taxes for that level of service, and they need to feel safer, and they don't feel safe. All of that kind of discussion is really important. So that my frustration is that we operate in a way that creates independence, but doesn't really work out what that independence is for, or I went to Vodafone recently to look at their amazing headquarters, and they have this phrase where they've said that all the development in Vodafone recently has to come down to this question of, so what? You know, we do it this way, so what? What's the outcome? And I think the criminal justice system could do well ask itself, so what? More often.
Any more questions? Down the front.
Katie Sawyer, Reform. My question is for Commissioner Simmonds. And you mentioned your desire to integrate police and fire services, and indeed Sir Ken Knight's review highlighted these opportunities and potentially the opportunities of PCCs there. But you say you're not looking at ambulance integration. And will it not become more difficult to bring the ambulance service in when their needs haven't been considered from the outset? There's an appetite for reform now. Can the full opportunity not really be taken?
Yeah, that's a small question. The reason why I mentioned the ambulance service is that it's regionalised at the moment. It's EMAS, or certainly for us, the East Midlands Ambulance Service is regionalised. So it's a completely different kind of conversation trying to sort out that. And people already think I'm nuts for suggesting the fire service should work together with the police. So the fire service in Northamptonshire and the police service, I've got a window of opportunity. The county council wants this to happen, and they're the fire authority right now. Chief constable's looking forward to running the fire service. So there's an element, I'm here, let's get this thing done before, you know, I turn into a pumpkin in 2016. So there's a window of opportunity. The Home Secretary, I hope, is going to announce some legislative arrangements to help us move to that in a more formal way. But with or without that, we're going to integrate so far up together that it's one service. But I'll let you into a little other plan that I have, which is that, you know, if I can't unpack the East Midlands ambulance service, what I can do is get our first responders in the fire service trained to be sufficiently paramedic enabled. You know, we'll send them to university, they'll become paramedics. So we'll have, you know, 50 fire officers who are paramedics, and we'll borrow from the New York Fire Department, which is New York Police Department, and buy ambulances and stuff. So you could start to train people and respond to things in a way that you kind of make the East Midlands Ambulance Service, well, we'll deal with that because here in Northamptonshire we operate like this. I'm not suggesting in the same way as I've had to tell police officers, I don't mean put 2 buckets of water in the boot and a ladder on the roof. That's what I mean by an integrated fire service with the police. We will do it sophisticatedly, we'll do it within the law, we'll do everything we need to do to make people safe. But I'm not going to unpick an existing risk structure, I'm just going to work around it. But that's, I guess, for a second term.
Final question. Thank you.
Just generally to the panel, do you have a view on the role of the private sector in police transformation?
I'm agnostic. Where it can help, I'd welcome it.
Yeah, the phrase right sourcing for me, so it doesn't matter if it's public, private or other, as long as it's the right solution.
What we've got to do is ensure that our police services are as efficient as possible and deliver everything as well as they can before even thinking about opening them up to competition, because otherwise there will be competition against something that's inefficient. That's my job now.
Right, well, on that note, thank you very much for coming. Hope that's given you a good insight into what the role's like and the kinds of people who are performing it. So thank you again for coming, and can we thank our panel for...